Book 3, The Church of the Servant Girls, Part 3, of The Prophets of Religion, by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Church Triumphant. The question may be asked, what of it? What if the church were to rule? There are not a few Americans who believe that there have to be rich and poor, and that rule by Roman Catholics might be preferable to rule by Socialists. Before you decide, at least do not fail to consider what history has to tell about priestly government. We do not have to use our imaginations in the matter, for there was once a golden age, such as Archbishop Quigley dreams of, when the power of the church was complete, when emperors and princes paid homage to her, and the civil authority made haste to carry out her commands. What was the condition of the people in those times? We are told by Lee in his History of the Inquisition that the moral condition of the laity was unutterably depraved. Uniformity of faith had been enforced by the Inquisition and its methods, and so long as faith was preserved, crime and sin was comparatively unimportant, except as a source of revenue to those who sold absolution. As Theodoric Vrie tersely puts it, hell and purgatory would be emptied if enough money could be found. The artificial standard thus created is seen in a revelation of the Virgin to Saint Birgitta that a pope who was free from heresy, no matter how polluted by sin and vice, is not so wicked but that he has the absolute power to bind and loose souls. There are many wicked popes plunged in hell, but all their lawful acts on earth are accepted and confirmed by God, and all priests who are not heretics administer true sacraments, no matter how depraved they may be. Correctness of belief was thus the sole essential. Virtue was a wholly subordinate consideration. How completely under such a system religion and morals came to be dissociated is seen in the remarks of Pius II, that the Franciscans were excellent theologians, but cared nothing about virtue. This, in fact, was the direct result of the system of persecution embodied in the Inquisition. Heretics who were admitted to be patterns of virtue were ruthlessly exterminated in the name of Christ, while in the same holy name the orthodox could purchase absolution for the vilest of crimes for a few coins. When the only unpardonable offense was persistence in some trifling error of belief, such as the poverty of Christ, when men had before them the example of their spiritual guides as leaders in vice and debauchery and contempt of sacred things, all the sanctions of morality were destroyed, and the confusion between right and wrong became hopeless. The world has probably never seen a society more vile than that of Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries. The brilliant pages of Froissart fascinate us with their pictures of the artificial courtesies of chivalry. The mystic reveries of Risbreck and of Tauler show us that spiritual life survived in some rare souls, but the mass of the population was plunged into the depths of sensuality and the most brutal oblivion of the moral law. For this, Alvaro Pelayo tells us that the priesthood were accountable, and that, in comparison with them, the laity were holy. What was that state of comparative holiness he proceeds to describe, blushing as he writes for the benefit of confessors, giving a terrible sketch of universal immorality which nothing could purify but fire and brimstone from heaven. The chroniclers do not often pause in their narrations to dwell on the moral aspects of the times, but Meyer, in his Annals of Flanders, under date of 1379, tells us that it would be impossible to describe the prevalence everywhere of perjuries, blasphemies, adulteries, hatreds, quarrels, brawls, murder, rapine, thievery, robbery, gambling, whoredom, debauchery, avarice, oppression of the poor, rape, drunkenness, and similar vices, and he illustrates his statement with the fact that in the territory of Ghent, within the space of 10 months, there occurred no less than 1,400 murders committed in the bagnios, brothels, gambling houses, taverns, and other similar places. When, in 1396, Jean Saint-Peur led his crusaders to destruction at Micopolis, their crimes and cynical debauchery scandalized even the Turks, and led to the stern rebuke of Bajazet himself, who as the monk of St. Denis admits was much better than his Christian foes. The same writer, moralizing over the disaster at Agincourt, attributes it to the general corruption of the nation. Sexual relations, he says, were an alternation of disorderly lust and of incest. Commerce was naught but fraud and treachery. Avarice withheld from the church her tithes, and ordinary conversation was a succession of blasphemies. The church, set up by God as a model and protector of the people, was false to all its obligations. The bishops, through the basest and most criminal of motives, were habitual acceptors of persons. They anointed themselves with the last essence extracted from their flocks, and there was in them nothing of holy, of pure, of wise, or even of decent. God in the schools. But that, you may say, was a long time ago. If so, let us take a modern country in which the Catholic Church has worked its will. Until recently, Spain was such a country. Now the people are turning against the clerical machine, and if you ask why, turn to Raphael Shaw's Spain from Within. On every side the people see the baleful hand of the church, interfering or trying to interfere in their domestic life, ordering the conditions of employment, draining them of their hard-won livelihood by trusts and monopolies established and maintained in the interest of the religious orders, placing obstacles in the way of their children's education, hindering them in the exercise of their constitutional rights, and deliberately ruining those of them who are bold enough to run counter to priestly dictation. Riots suddenly break out in Barcelona. They are instigated by the Jesuits. The country goes to war in Morocco. It is dragged into it solely in defense of the mines owned, actually, if not ostensibly, by the Jesuits. The consumes cannot be abolished because the Jesuits are financially interested in their continuance. We have read the statement of a Jesuit father that the state cannot justly enforce compulsory education even in case of utter illiteracy. How has that doctrine worked out in Spain? There was an official investigation of school conditions, the report appearing in the Heraldo de Madrid for November 1909. In 1857 there had been passed a law requiring a certain number of schools in each of the 79 provinces. This requirement being below the very low standards prevailing at that time in other European countries. Yet in 1909 it was found that only 4 provinces had the required number of elementary schools, and at the rate of increase then prevailing, it would have taken 150 years to catch up. 75% of the population were wholly illiterate, and 30,000 towns and villages had no government schools at all. The government owed nearly $1,500,000 in unpaid salaries to the teachers. The private schools were nearly all nuns' schools, which taught only needlework and catechism. The punishments prevailing in them were cruel and disgusting. As to the location of the schools, a report of the Minister of Education to the Cortes, the Parliament of Spain, sets forth as follows: More than 10,000 schools are on hired premises, and many of these are absolutely destitute of hygienic conditions. There are schools mixed up with hospitals, with cemeteries, with slaughterhouses, with stables. One school forms the entrance to a cemetery, and the corpses are placed on the master's table while the last responses are being said. There is a school into which the children cannot enter until the animals have been sent out to pasture. Some are so small that as soon as the warm weather begins, the boys faint for want of air and ventilation. One school is a manure heap in process of fermentation, and one of the local authorities has said that in this way the children are warmer in winter. One school in Cataluna adjoins the prison. Another, in Andalusia, is turned into an enclosure for the bulls when there is a bullfight in the town. These conditions excited the indignation of a Spanish educator by the name of Francesco Ferrer. He founded what he called a "modern school," in which the pupils should be taught science and common sense. He drew, of course, the bitter hatred of the Catholic hierarchy, which saw in the spread of his principles the end of their mastery of the people. When the Barcelona Insurrection took place, they had Ferrer seized upon a charge of having been its instigator. They had him tried in secret before a military tribunal, convicted upon forged documents, and shot beneath the walls of the fortress of Montjuich. The case was thoroughly investigated by William Archer, one of England's leading critics, a man of scrupulous rectitude of mind. His conclusion is that Ferrer was absolutely innocent of the charges against him, and that his execution was the result of a clerical plot. Of Ferrer's character Archer writes: Fragmentary though they be, the utterances which I have quoted form a pretty complete revelation. From first to last we see in him an ardent, uncompromising, incorruptible idealist. His ideals are narrow and his devotion to them fanatical, but it is devoid, if not of egoism, at any rate of self-interest and self-seeking. As he shrank from applying the money entrusted him to ends of personal luxury, so also he shrank from making his ideas and convictions subserve any personal ambition or vanity. The Menace. There are, of course, many people in America who will not rest idle while their country falls into the condition of Spain. There are anti-Catholic propaganda societies, which send out lecturers to discuss the church and its records, and this is exasperating to devout believers who regard the church as holy and any criticism of it as blasphemy. So we have opportunity to observe the working out of the doctrine that the Church is superior to the civil law. On June 12, 1913, there came to the little town of Alwyn, Iowa, a former priest of the Catholic Church named Jeremiah J. Crowley, to deliver a lecture exposing the papal propaganda. The Catholics of the town made efforts to intimidate the owner of the place in which the lecture was to be given. The priest of the town, Father O'Connor, preached a sermon furiously denouncing the lecturer, and after the lecture the unfortunate Crowley was surrounded by a mob of men, women, and boys, and although he was 6'3" in size, he was beaten almost to death. At the trial which followed, it developed that Father O'Connor and also his brother, a judge on the superior bench, were accessories before the fact. Nor is this a solitary instance. The Catholic military societies, with their uniforms and their armories, are not maintained for nothing. As Archbishop Quigley declared before the German Catholic Central Verein, "We have well-ordered and efficient organizations, all at the beck and nod of the hierarchy and ready to do what the church authorities tell them to do. With these bodies of loyal Catholics ready to step into the breach at any time and present an unbroken front to the enemy, we may feel secure." And so, on the evening of April 15th, 1914, a group of Catholics entered the Pierce Hotel in Denver, Colorado, overpowered a police guard, and seized the Reverend Otis L. Spurgeon, an anti-Catholic lecturer. They bound and gagged him, took him to a lonely woods, and beat him to insensibility. The same thing happened to the Reverend Augustus Barnett at Buffalo. The Reverend William Black was killed at Marshall, Texas. In each case the assailants avowed themselves Knights of Columbus, and efforts to punish them failed, because no jury can be got to convict a Catholic fighting for his Pope against a godless state. The most pious Leo XIII has laid down, "It is an impious deed to break the laws of Jesus Christ for the purpose of obeying the magistrates, or to transgress the law of the Church under the pretext of observing the civil law." There are papers published to warn Americans against the plotting of this political church. One of them, The Menace, has a circulation of more than 1 million. And naturally the Knights of Slavery do not enjoy reading it. Year after year they have marshaled their power to have this paper barred from the mails. So far in vain. They caused an obscenity prosecution, which failed. So finally the press rooms of the paper were blown up with dynamite. At the present time there is a Catholic Truth Society, with a publication called Truth, to oppose the anti-Catholic campaign, and that is all right, of course, except when the agents who collect the $2 subscriptions to this publication make use of untruth in their labors, promising absolution and salvation to the families, dead and living, of those who "come across" with subscriptions. In the Bulletin of the American Federation of Catholic Societies, for September, 1915, I find a record of the ceaseless plotting to bar criticism of the Catholic Church from the mails. Fitzgerald, a Tammany Catholic congressman, proposes a bill in Washington, and Judge St. Paul, of New Orleans, a member of the Federation's Law Committee, points out the difficulties in the way of such legislation. You cannot pass a law against ridiculing religion, because the Catholics want to ridicule Christian Science, Mormonism, and the Holy Ghost and Us Society. The judge thinks the purpose of the papal plotters will be accomplished if they can slip into the present law the words scurrilous and slanderous. He hopes that this much can be done without the American people catching on. You read these things for the first time, perhaps, and you want to start an American Kulturkampf. I make haste, therefore, to restate the main thesis of this book. It is not the New Inquisition which is our enemy today. It is hereditary privilege. It is not superstition, but big business which makes use of superstition as a wolf makes use of sheep's clothing. You remember how, when Americans first awakened to the universal corruption of our politics, we used to attribute it to the ignorant foreign vote. Turn to Lecky's Democracy and Liberty, and you will see how reformers 20 years ago explained our political depravity. But we probed deeper, and discovered that the purely American communities, such as Rhode Island, were the most corrupt of all. It dawned upon us that wherever there was a political boss paying bribes on election day, there was a captain of industry furnishing the money for the bribes, and taking some public privilege in return. So we came to realize that political corruption is merely a byproduct of big business. And when we come to probe this problem of the spread of superstition in America, this amazing renaissance of Romanism in a democracy, we find precisely the same phenomenon. It is not the poor foreigner who troubles us. Our human magic would win him, our easygoing trust, our quiet certainty of liberty, our open-handed and open-homed and hail-fellow well-met democracy. We should break down the Catholic machine, and not all the priests in the hierarchy could stop us. Were it not for the Steel Trust, and the Coal Trust, and the Beef Trust, the Liquor Trust, and the Traction Trust, and the Money Trust, those masters of America who do not want citizens free and intelligent and self-governing, but who want the slave hordes as they come, ignorant, inert, physically, mentally, and morally helpless. No, do not let yourself be lured into a Kulturkampf. It is not the pennies of the servant girls which build the towering cathedrals. It is not the $2 contributions for the salvation of souls which support the Catholic Truth Society, and the Knights of Columbus, and the Holy Name Society, and the Mary Sodality, and the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception, and all the rest of the machinery of the papal propaganda. These help, of course, but the main sources of growth are, first, the subsidies of industrial exploiters, the majority of whom are non-Catholic, and second, the privilege of public plunder granted as payment for votes by politicians who are creatures and puppets of big business. End of Book 3, Part 3.